Hello and welcome back to Granbury Volunteer Fire Department's online fire academy, and today we're going to cover section 10 water supplies per SFFMA. Again, I am Matt Hohan, captain of operations here at Granbury, and if you have any questions, make sure to write them down. We're going to jump right into this slideshow. Let's take a look at your very first picture. This is a pretty serious water shuttle operation, and unfortunately, you're never going to see anything like this in Hood County. The best that you're ever going to get is nurse tanker operations, and the way a nurse tanker is set up is you have one dedicated truck that you're pumping from, and all the other trucks will pull up, offload their water to the nurse tanker, and then they'll depart to go refill. It's been a really long time since I've seen drop tank operations here in the county, and maybe after discussion not only here in our rookie school but at our home departments, maybe we can pick this back up sooner or later. Without further ado, water supplies starts now. Identify the water distribution system and other alternate water sources in the area of responsibility. So the first thing we're going to look at is this bottom right slide, water supply distribution system. And we're going to start at the source. And Granbury has two water sources. One, we have Lake Granbury, and two, we actually have city water wells outside of the city. That water from the lake and from the water wells is piped and pumped to the treatment plant. Once it gets to the water treatment plant, it is then piped and pumped to our storage tanks and throughout the system as a whole. Once the water is physically being demanded from the storage tank, it'll go down main water lines and into businesses and neighborhoods. And that is a very small part of how basically our water distribution system works here in the city. Now, in the county, the vast majority of the county, other than some of the cities out there who have water systems similar to Granbury, they operate off of water wells or storage tanks on property or on site. It's the same basic principle for use of water at those structures, but from a firefighting point of view, it's not enough water for us to do anything. So we have to physically bring our water with us to the scene, and we do that through our tanker pumpers and tankers. Identify a dry barrel and a wet barrel hydrant. Now I'm going to tell you this, there's a major difference between a dry barrel and a wet barrel hydrant. And one has a valve that is located below ground level, and that's going to be the dry barrel hydrant, and a wet barrel hydrant is going to have a valve that's basically operated at the top of the hydrant. And that valve is physically what opens and closes and allows water to come out of that hydrant. And my question to you is, why do we have two different types of hydrants? Why does one that has a valve that's buried in the ground, and why does one have the other one with the valve at the top of the hydrant? I want you to see if you can figure this out and write your answer down and come back for the answer. The difference between a dry and wet barrel hydrant is freezing locations. Any place that has any potential of a freezing level in the ground, they will have a dry barrel hydrant. A wet barrel hydrant is primarily going to only be used in locations that don't freeze. Prime example of this in the places I have seen wet barrel hydrants is Florida and very far south Texas and New Orleans. A dry barrel hydrant is very particular in its operation because if it has a fault with anywhere inside the hydrant, you may not be able to get any water out of the valve or out of the water line. Whereas a wet barrel hydrant, you have a couple of different options as far as being able to get that hydrant open and guaranteed to get water. About the only limitation on a wet barrel hydrant is if you physically have no waters in the line. Hydrant to pump hose connections for forward and reverse lays. Okay, a forward hose lay is when the fire truck physically connects to the hydrant and then drives to the scene. So the truck pulls up next to the hydrant, a firefighter gets out, he grabs the hydrant hose, the supply line, and starts to connect it to the hydrant. From that point, the fire truck is going to actually finish making scene, and they're going to pull up in front of the structure. That is a forward hose lay. A reverse hose lay is when the fire department pulls up on scene, they pull their hose off that they need, they pull the supply line to the scene, and then they send the fire truck down the road to the actual hydrant. Now, a split hose lay is best explained by looking at the bottom right picture. And you can see that you have two different fire trucks at the same intersection. And the purpose of this is one truck's going to be at the hydrant, the other truck is going to be pulling up to the structure, and the common meeting point is the intersection. That's a split hose lay. Now, to go in a little more detail as far as what hose lays we use here in Granbury and in Hood County, I don't know if I've ever seen a reverse hose lay or a split hose lay used. For us, we use a forward hose lay, and we'll go in great detail on the skills night on how to set that up and then ultimately send the truck down the road to the scene. Use of a rural dry fire hydrant system and static water supply sources. I do not know of any rural dry fire hydrants that sit out in the county. What I do know that sits in the county is there is storage water tanks around the county, and some of those tanks do have stores fittings to be able to physically connect the truck to the tank. And it is gravity and water pressure that's used to fill the fire apparatus. Now, static water supply sources, they're unlimited in the county. And examples of static water supply sources could be a swimming pool, the river, the lake, a pond, and any other potential source that's holding water. All it has to do is hold water, and that is a static water supply source. Take a second, and I want you to write down of at least one water source that you know is a static water supply source in your service area. Go ahead and write that down. Tanker shuttle. Now, what you have seen right here in this picture is a pretty advanced water supply and shuttling system set up. And what you barely see at the bottom picture is a light bar. That light bar is connected to an actual fire engine, and that fire engine is the one that's maintaining each one of those 4 drop tanks. The other truck that's at the top center in this picture is the shuttle tanker. He's going to go fill up with water, he's going to return back to scene, and he's going to quickly dump his water back into one of these drop tanks, and then they're going to leave again, and they're going to go fill up with water, and they're going to continue to do this until there's no more water required for the extinguishment and overhaul and mop up of the structure fire they're working. These relay systems are really practical. The one limiting factor, and this is more note for Hood County, is that if you didn't know this, Hood County is the 3rd smallest county in the state of Texas. On top of that, Hood County has 9 volunteer fire departments in it. Each and every one of those fire departments has a minimum of at least one 2,000-gallon pumper and tanker. Now, just do the simple math on that. You have a minimum of 18,000 gallons of water that's ready to be at your fingertips, and realistically, with even the furthest out responding departments, at the maximum of 20 minutes. So, on the vast majority of our fires that we have in town or in the county, you have a massive volume of water that's coming to you in the form of just tanker pumpers. And on top of that, when those trucks do empty water and they have to go refill, they're not having to drive super long distances, taking a super long time to be able to actually operate these structure fires accordingly. And because of that, you rarely see shuttle operations set up like this. This is more for a very rural area that has limited water supplies and has much longer response times and much longer distances that they're traveling. A couple of years ago, I talked to a volunteer fire department out in West Texas, and their service area is literally the size of Connecticut. And it's one department. They may go as long as an hour and a half en route before they make scene. Because of this, they have a contract with a local oil field company that has water tankers for their use staged every 30 miles. And that significantly helps them with their water supply problem. Tanker shuttles is something that's entirely different to each region that they're operating in. And it really is. It's something that's kind of cool to look more into. But from a Hood County point of view, we keep it pretty basic. Provide water at rural locations by relay pumping, large diameter hose, and or tanker shuttle. First thing I want to talk about is relay pumping. Let's say you're doing an incredibly long hose lay. Let's call it a mile long. Well, one engine pumping a mile long worth of water, by the time that water gets to the end of that hose, there's not going to be much pressure in it. So you're going to have to start putting pumpers in between different sections of the hose in different stages. And that's just to help boost the pressure and so you can get more water faster at the actual scene of the structure fire. And you do that just because the pressure decrease over really long stretches is too much. And on an example of a mile-long hose lay, you may need a total of 4 engines for that hose lay. Now, large diameter hose, we want to use large diameter hose because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the true pumping engine on scene of the fire has more water than what it needs. And then, of course, we've already talked about tanker shuttles. And again, guys, if you have any questions or you need clarification on how tanker shuttles work, always ask in your home department first. And if you have any other questions, bring them back to class. Deployment of a portable water tank. We will do this in our skills class, and you guys will know how to set up, fill, and ultimately drain a portable water tank. Identify the following parts of the water distribution system: distributors, primary feeders, secondary feeders. We're going to start with the feeder pipe, the primary feeder. It's also known as your main water pipe or water main. And the places where a main water is going to be run is down 377, 144, Acton Highway, 51 North, any major road. Okay. Now, any major road is going to have smaller roads that break off of it. And down those smaller roads, under those roads, is where the secondary feeder pipes are going to be at. So the example I'm going to give you is that you're down 377. That's where the main water main's going to be at. And then if you turn down Water's Edge and you start to go towards the community down Water's Edge, you'll be following the secondary feeders. Once you continue down Water's Edge Road, you'll get to smaller side streets that actually break off and go to little cul-de-sacs and just dead-end roads. And that's where your distributor water pipes will be at. And those are the pipes that are running to houses. Now, one thing to take note of real quick here is your water main, that's a large water pipe. Minimum 14 inches. And I know next year Granbury's going to be upgrading to 16-inch water mains. Now, your secondary feeder pipe, that's typically a 12-inch water pipe. And then finally, your distributor pipe is an 8-inch pipe. The other thing that I want to point out in here is all the valves in our little diagram. It's real important to be able to isolate water pipes just so that we can actually control in the event that you have a water pipe failure, so that the water doesn't just continue to gush out of the water. Or correction, doesn't continue to gush out of the water main or the secondary. And then lastly is the physical hydrants. And you can see on their little diagram where the hydrants are displayed at. Hydrants can be connected to feeders, they can be connected to secondary, and they can also be connected to distributors. If you have any questions on this slide, go ahead and write them down and ask the instructors. Now, per the requirements of SFFMA, terms as they relate to water supply. Normal operating pressure of a water distribution system is just the pressure that's needed to physically be able to flow water through the system and ultimately have water come out the tap. And you want to be on the low side of that pressure that actually gets water to flow through the house. Now, you need to be able to physically fill the water tanks in the house quickly, but you also don't want a water pressure system so high that when you go to turn the water faucet on, it blows the coffee can out of your hand. Another thing to consider is the residual pressure of a water distribution system. And this is the pressure that's in the system once the water's physically flowing. If there's no water flowing, the pressure will rise and cap out. And that's going to be the normal operating pressure. The residual pressure is when the tap is open and water's physically flowing through the line. There will be a pressure drop. The flow pressure is from an opening that is flowing water. So that's a pressure that's directly taken as soon as the tap's open and the pressure coming out of the tap. And lastly, static pressure. And the best way to describe static pressure is imagine having a milk jug filled with water. If I poke a hole in the very top of the milk jug, the water's barely going to trickle out because the weight of the water that's above the top of the milk jug is very light. There's almost no weight there. The static pressure is very low. So the water is barely going to trickle out. But if I take the same pin that I used to create the hole at the top and I go to the very bottom of the milk jug and poke a hole, the water is going to squirt out with quite a bit of velocity. And that's because there's a lot more static pressure sitting above the opening. The reason static pressure is important is particularly when you're dealing with a water distribution system and storage, like a water tower that has the water held hundreds of feet in the air, or also if the actual water storage tanks are sitting up on hills. Following types of water main valves. An indicating water valve is going to show you whether the physical valve is open or closed. Okay? And what I mean by that is it's going to physically tell you with some type of identification marker on the actual valve as to which way the water is flowing. Now, a non-indicating valve is a valve that would basically just have a twisting nut on the top of the valve, and you would have to physically turn the nut, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, to know if the valve is open or closed. Now, a post-indicator valve has a literal swinging flag, and if that flag is vertical to what the water flow of the pipe should be, then the valve would be closed. And if you spin the valve, that flag's going to turn and align itself with the flow of water, and that's going to indicate that the actual water's flowing through the valve. The last type is an outside screw and yoke valve, OS and Y. The easiest way to remember this type of valve is the physical threading on the outside of the pipe, and it's what the twisting handle spins down. If the handle is spun down to the bottom and it's showing a lot of screw threads on the outside of the OS and Y valve, that means that valve is closed. If you spin the handle and there's not many threads showing above the handle, that means that valve is open. Explain the 4 fundamental components of modern water systems. The sources of supply. So is our water supply surface water or groundwater? Again, in Hood County's case and in Granbury's case, it's a mixture of both. The means of moving water. Direct pumping system, gravitational system, or combination system. A lot of this has to do with ultimately the physical terrain at where the water system's located. If you're in a very flat area, you're going to have a direct pumping system to bring water from the treatment plant to the water storage towers, and then from that point, gravity will take over. But if you're in a mountainous area, you're probably going to have a lot more of a gravity type system where the storage for the city or town will physically be above their elevation, and gravity will do the vast majority of the work. At the end of the day, almost every city and every town out there has a combination for both. Treatment facilities. The list is long and extravagant for this. And Granbury is a great example of this. We have chemical treatment, we have a desalinization plant, and the list goes on. At the end of the day, there's multiple facilities used for treating water. And then lastly, storage facilities and distribution systems. For Granbury, we do have in-ground storage, above-ground storage, and then ultimately whatever's stored in the physical pipe itself and can be moved by gravity. And lastly, the distribution system for us is always going to be water pipes. If you have any questions about this slide, write them down and let the instructors know. Hydrant testing. The use of a pitot tube and gauge to read and record several flow pressures. So, insurance requirements require us to test hydrants occasionally, and then it's also just good practice to actually test your hydrant occasionally. And from a volunteer fire department's perspective, the question is time. How on earth do you find time to actually test the hydrants in your town? Well, a lot of that has to do with how many hydrants you physically have. One thing I would tell you to consider from a volunteer fire department's perspective is if you have any hydrants in your area, you need to physically go out there and open those hydrants up at least once every year. Why do you want to do that? Here's why. Can you even open the hydrant? How long's it been since that hydrant's been open? I couldn't tell you how many times I've went to use a hydrant and it took 6 people and a 6-foot extension to be able to physically open the hydrant to only break off the valve at the stem. Testing your hydrants are critical. And as far as making sure the hydrant opens, that's only half the equation. We ran into this in Granbury in January of this year. If you're at a location with a hydrant and you get it open, what kind of water pressure are you getting? If the truck pumps on an average of 1,000 gallons per minute and you're only getting 200 gallons per minute while the hydrant's open, is that doing anything for you? The answer is no. Testing your hydrants is critical, and the actual procedures that are used for testing hydrants in your area, I want you to get that from your in-house officers and your firefighters at your home stations. Recommended minimum pipe sizes used in the following areas: residential, business, and industrial. We're going to go back to the original graph that we saw a few slides ago. Your typical residential water pipe sizes is typically going to be the distributor pipe, 8-inch pipes. Now businesses outside of like Walmart, Home Depot, and Lowe's, and Kroger's, they're going to use the secondary feeder pipes, just a 12-inch pipe. And if you're dealing with large industrial or large commercial, they're going to be attached directly to your large feeder pipes. If If you have any questions about these or what piping size you have in your area, it's probably going to be a little easier handled by physically talking to your in-house officers. And if they don't know, go talk to your local city. Figure out what they're using. Two causes of increased resistance or friction loss in water mains. The first one, mineral incrustation or tuberculation. Real fancy word there. All we're talking about is if you have hard water, over time, it's going to crust up on the inside of the pipe. Why is that bad? Because ultimately that's going to reduce the diameter of the pipe, and as you decrease the diameter of the pipe, you're decreasing the physical volume of water moving through the pipe, and it's going to require more pressure to move a given volume of water through the pipe. Secondly, sedimentation. Both of these are actually very common in Granbury. Not only do we have crushingly terrible water, but at least we have dirty water and lots of sand. Sedimentation occurs as the pipes get old and degrade. They're going to start cracking, and dirt is literally going to start falling in through those cracks, and it's going to start filling the pipe. If you have any questions, make sure you write them down and ask them in class.